Okay. So I put the jQuery stuff up here because it's just a little bit closer to what people have done for a long time. Page. What this jQuery code is doing is this first line here, and this is some shorthand, which is why people like jQuery instead of having to do it with JavaScript automatic, what's built into your browser. It's saying, essentially, give me a reference. Let me have a handle this element, this ID hash, the same way that CSS uses a hash to say ID. It's using a similar syntax. So if you wanted to get something using classes instead of an ID with jQuery, what do you think you might use? You'd use the dot, because in like CSS you use dot to designate a class, and that hash symbol designates an ID. And so this is just trying to get an element of some kind. And then I'm keeping a reference to that element. And then jQuery has a function that's part of the library that's called text. And what it says is it gets the combined text contents of each element in the set of matched elements, including their descendants, or sets the text contents of the matched elements. So let's look at the set type call for it down here. We'll scroll down. And if we call the text method with an argument, which is a string, number, or Boolean of some kind, that text on the element. So, in this case, or in our case, we have the test element, and then we call text with some text for it, and so it sets that value. And you saw that you could also call it with nothing. So if we did var original text equals test.text, we're going to get whatever the text was before. And now let's say, instead of replacing it, we want to add to our old text. Well, we've got a reference to it already, so we could do something like original text plus the new stuff. So originally I had not working in here, and I read that value out, and then I replace it with something new in this line. So it's a way, jQuery is really a useful library, or used traditionally as a way to get a lot of these hooks into your HTML and change it dynamically. And you can change all sorts of things in very powerful ways. Does that generally make sense? Maybe not all of the exact details of how jQuery got that, but the idea of being able to have a hook into your, change that content. So now I'm going to revisit the React code, and I'm going to break this out a little bit. What you'll notice when you work with React is there's a habit of inlining a lot of things that maybe are easier, if at least to think about initially, if instead you set them as variables, because they don't have to be done sort of inline this way. So let me rewrite this just a little bit and see if it makes it any easier for people to going on. Let's say this. HTML content equals div hello div. And then var React container element equals document.get element by ID container. Oops. No, that is what I wanted to get rid of. Okay. So now we could replace this code with something that maybe looks closer to function calls it might be used to. HTML content and React container element, right? We're just passing it to it's just a function call with 2 arguments. Is that a little easier to read? I tend to think it is. Like I say, you need to get used to at least reading a lot of code that's not written that way, that sort of inlines that stuff. But if you're struggling with it or you can't quite figure out what's going on, a good strategy is to break it down like this bit by bit so that you're thinking about individual pieces. So now what's going on with React DOM.render is that it is looking for, or it takes 2 arguments. It takes its HTML, or actually I should rename this and say JSX content, because that's really what it is that we're passing in. And then it also takes the place to put its content, the place to hook into. So if we go back and look at the HTML that we had, let's comment this stuff out. Here we have our div with a container. That's what this document.getElementById is doing. This is the built-in way in the browser to do the same thing that this little jQuery line was doing. So this is part of the JavaScript library for getting elements in the browser without using jQuery. And you can begin to see a little bit why people like something like jQuery. It can make a lot of things easier. But we're not doing that. So I could replace this with something with some jQuery to do some of that same type of thing. It would just be a slightly different syntax. But React DOM.render now, what it's doing is it's saying, all right, at this location, in this element, render my content, the content that you're passing into me, this JSX content. And that just happens to be this div hello div. So it's saying at this location, render my content. And now if we look at our output, we can see that we have hello, or if we change it, like bonjour, or whatever, and it's rendering inside of this container, which is where we've sort of connected React. Yeah?
So is render just like giving you back what it's looking for?
Let's pull up just the React documentation. Make sure that I'm doing this correct. My Hangouts too. Oops. Okay, I'm gonna do that. All right, I think everything's correct here. Wait, did it lose my? Why did it stop my screen sharing? All right. Let's pull up the React documentation. You know what? I have it. Oh, they say is going on. And I don't know if you'll feel like it clarifies what's happening or not. So reference React DOM. So if we pull up the actual documentation, we jump to the render documentation. Here it says, render a React element into the DOM in the supplied container and return a reference to the component. So you can see, here's our container. That's our second argument. And here's the React element. And all it means when it says render is basically, I mean, there's a lot more going on, but React tries to give you a very simple interface and simple way to work with it at the high level. So the difference, in a sense, between that React DOM.render is trying to be something very similar in syntax to this test .text thing. You could think of this almost as a .render. Like, make this the body of my element, right? Render it into it. That's what this React DOM.render is trying to do as well. It's saying render this content into this location. and it's acting like you're doing this just once, like just render this content and everything will be fine and you don't have to do anything beyond that. There's actually a lot of sort of magic that you don't have to get into at first going on behind the scenes with React when it does that, because it's doing a lot more than just hooking up and rendering it once. And that's where, when we get all the way to the last step of this tutorial, we can talk in more detail about what's actually going on with that render connection and sort of the React magic behind the scenes there.
So, does it matter that you don't have to render before the element?
Before the element?
The element that, by ID. Because on the examples there is a React on that render was on top, and the bottom was the element by ID. So does it matter if you have it before?
Like usually what you're saying is, I don't know if I can even back up, but a lot of times they were writing it this way, right? Where it was inlined in here.
Right. So it doesn't matter if you put it before the render.
So what you have to do here is look at this. All I did by putting it up here in a variable was just make it a little easier to see what's going on with each one of these steps, because we have to break this down step by step. Here is our React DOM.render call, right? Bracketed by these parentheses. So before it actually makes that call, it first has to, you know, the interpreter or whatever has to read through each expression that make up the parameters for it and evaluate those expressions into something that it can understand. So before it actually calls React DOM.render, it parses all this code and it says, oh, here's some JSX. Now I have to turn that into something that I can actually send as an argument. So it processes that. And here in document.getElementById, it actually runs this and passes that in. It would be, it's equivalent to saying, is there a difference, if you will? Now, I think we can use the console because I think console stuff outputs to their console here. Is there a difference between doing console.log 4 plus 5 versus var sum equals 4 plus 5 console.log sum? Let's see if this works. I don't know if it'll let me log those. Okay, it does. So there's not really a difference between these two statements. One of them just inlined the expression that needed to be evaluated at 4 plus 5, whereas the other one had you evaluate it first and then just used a variable pointing to the result of it, right? That's the difference. That's the same as the difference between this sort of inlined expression of these versus if we switched it to what we had here, which was the HTML content and React container element. There's not a difference between those two different ways of writing that, really. This is just, the only reason I did this was so that when you're looking at it, you can think about a smaller piece at a time. Oh, render does something. It takes 2 arguments. They mean something. And then you can go, oh, React container element, I can see what's going on there and break that. I wrote it this way to help break it down a little more, be easier to understand. But does that make sense? Any other questions on this right now? If we take it back to more like what it looked like originally, right? We didn't have this line. All right. Now we're sort of what we were originally creating here. People feel somewhat comfortable with this. This is a little weird and probably not something that a lot of people who aren't used to languages, a lot of languages would pick up on immediately, because this is not valid JavaScript. this line right here is completely invalid. It's not a variable or a string or an object or something like that, because there's no quotes around it to make it a string or an object or anything else. This is the JSX from React, and so we'll step over to the next article and talk about that in more detail and what's going on. But the short answer to it is it's just it's really nice to be able to write your markup that way as opposed to the alternative inside of your JavaScript. And so they've built essentially, they were like, oh, let's just do that, and then we'll have an interpreter layer somewhere before it gets to the browser that converts it into valid JavaScript. What? So the JSX tutorial, who got to that one? Yeah? This is where some people got stuck, right? Okay. So what are some of the questions that people have on here so far?
For me, the button was pretty easy, but to get the variable that has a string, that was a little harder to kind of understand how to implement it. Because it kind of explains it on the top where it's saying if you do a string, just write a string.
Right.
But in this case, it was a variable, so it was different.
Right. And this is where being able to understand what counts as a JavaScript expression have a lot of use, because this is the place where understanding what is actually an expression versus some other things will be really valuable. And I'll be honest with you, when I first encountered React, this is probably something I screwed up more than just about anything else. Was I'm like, why isn't this working? Why can't I pass this in? Why isn't the variable being set correctly? So recognize, this is not something that I think was. I think it's really nice once you get a feel for it, but it's a big challenge at first, just to begin to understand it.
What I was trying to do, I think. It's a little confusing. He had components there already. So I thought I was supposed to do something like that, where he had like one of those made up components that was like XML.
Something like this.
So I was trying to make my own and then put this string inside that as well.
Right.
Which it wasn't even supposed to be that complicated. It was much easier.
Yeah. It was. Did anyone make it? Who made it past this one? Some people. All right. So talk about the JSX stuff, right? Unfortunately, I feel like you put too much in here, so there's a lot going on.
Yeah,
so let's look at just the first line of each one of these code blocks real fast. Up here we've got just div class name equals red div, right? That is, if you wrote that in valid JavaScript instead of writing it as JSX, so you were trying to write that out and let it be actual JavaScript, which you are allowed to do with React because it all gets translated down into this JavaScript code. And some people insist on doing that. They just don't like JSX. That line ends up being the equivalent of this down here, where we have react.createElement div, and then here's this is another one of these, everything's being inlined. So what type of element are we creating? We're creating a div element. What are the properties on this element? Class name of red is one of the properties, and that's the only one that we had set. And then what's the content inside of the element? In this case, it's just the string children text. So to these two, this one up here, div class name equals red and children text, versus this line of JavaScript, actual valid JavaScript, which one do you find easier to understand? This one down here, or the sort of JSX syntax up here? There's not a right or wrong answer. I'm just interested in hearing what people think.
Top one.
Yeah.
Do you think the top one's easier to understand?
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's generally, I think, why, like, that's why JSX exists, because most people tend to feel like that's easier. And especially if you're comfortable with HTML or XML, you know, this is a comfortable syntax. Like, if you've been writing, you guys just did the HTML tutorial on Free Code Camp and went through quite a few steps of that. So this should be very similar, right? Yeah, maybe some of the attribute names are a little different. This class name instead of class, and some other stuff like that, but should look and feel similar to the HTML you were doing.
Well, it's kind of like I said last class, being able to actually see the app change in front of you while you were working through the problems helped a lot with making it ingrained into why you do this, how you do this. If you want to make the app do this, then you can reference this section. It was very easy to follow, which is why that's easier to me than the one on the bottom.
Right. So I do have this. Let me go over to JSBin. I've already got a solution for all of these. So let me get my bins here. This probably isn't going to work, because how am I going to find the right one? There we go. All right. Is this right? No, this is the next one, isn't it? I may have to. Or is that the right one? Is it? All right. Sorry. Oh, yeah, that's what we're doing. So, yeah, I do have a solution to it. What did people have problems with on this who got to it and were working through it?
Using the variable part.
Using the variable part.
Yeah, because the other part I got it, but then I was like, it gave us the variables. I don't think I should just type it all out again.
Right.
And when I put it in there, it didn't show up. It just showed up what I typed in.
So you probably did this first, right?
Yeah.
And all you see is this ipsum text.
Yeah.
So this is the part of JSX that is a little trickier, because you're sort of it's sort of funny. This is why part of why JSX is somewhat controversial, or the idea, right? Mm-hmm. I talked before about how for CSS, for example, we sort of learned as an industry that it's good to separate our markup from our style, right? It's good to have the structure separate from the coloring and all these other elements, because it lets them sort of be independent. Structure really isn't dependent on that. We also, a long time ago, you know, as an industry, had a lot of debates back and forth about whether or not your templates, aka your markup, should be separate from the function of it, like the code that does something to it. And that's sort of the model of like a jQuery thing. You've got a document, you've got your HTML, and then you hook up some code to that separately, right? So your markup is independent of your code that's changing it. But as applications have gotten much more complicated, and really the application is creating the markup a lot of times nowadays, or changing it so drastically that they're not really that separate. React sort of revisited that and said, why should these be separate in the first place? You got your chocolate, my peanut butter. You got your peanut butter in my chocolate. Old reference, nobody's gonna get it, but it's Reese's peanut butter cups reference or whatever from their ancient commercials. And that's a little bit of what's going on here. And so when you create JSX like this and you inline it into JavaScript, because remember this is a JavaScript or a JavaScript-like file, how can I separate out the stuff that's just text, just JSX or whatever, from the stuff that is JavaScript or something related to JavaScript when I'm working with it? And that's where these, like putting these sort of curly braces comes in, because when React is parsing this whole little bit of code here or whatever, it's going through to create the actual JavaScript from this JSX, and it needs to know to consider something JavaScript instead of just some JSX text to be interpreted, and putting these curly braces around it is sort of that clue, that indicator. Hey, you need to evaluate this. Don't just, you know, run it right through directly. So yeah, it's a little tricky to get used to, but you can think of it as, I don't even know, you can think of it like I've got a JavaScript file, and then I temporarily switch over to JSX or whatever, and when I'm in this JSX mode of my file, if I want to reference anything in JavaScript, I need to put it inside of these curly braces so that it knows to evaluate this as JavaScript. So this is another example again of them inlining all this, right? Again, we could very easily have written it like this instead. I may need parentheses around this. In fact, I'm pretty sure I will. We could very easily have written it like this. So now JSX element. And then var React, like anchor, if you will. I don't know, I'm just using a slightly different term. That can be this, right? This is where we're connecting React. So I don't know if that helps people, breaking it down this way and setting these into variables so you can look at this function call sort of separate from the different pieces. This is saying, oh, here's a block of JSX, something special, and then here's the React anchor, and I want to insert this JSX in there. These curly braces around this, if anybody remembers when we were writing string literals in JavaScript, like var text equals with these sort of backticks. And we would insert, you know, other JavaScript inside of this $ parentheses inside of our string literal, right? And that was just an easy shorthand, so we didn't have to do concatenation or something else. That's pretty much what this is like inside of a JSX block. That's just an escape to say, oh, I'm getting something out here that's not part of this literal JSX. So it's the same sort of concept. And see, now that this thing is really just the same as up there, we could easily, instead of inserting ipsum text, we could just insert text, and it should behave the same, right? Any other sort of questions in this section? Issues that people had? Did people understand, anyone who read through it, like why we use class name inside of JSX instead of just using, instead of saying class for a property?
It's like a reserved word.
Yeah, it's because we're writing our JSX is being written inside of a JavaScript file, right, or close to it. And so class is a word that has meaning in JavaScript already. It's one of its reserved words that does something specific. It creates a class for objects. And so using class name is sort of a safeguard so that you never, the code can always know this is different than, this isn't JavaScript trying to create a class. There's no confusion. There's no issues with it. And it's less about when you're writing out your JSX just like this, but there's other ways you may create JSX or create your content for React that create more conflicts than when you're writing it out this sort of way. This is probably the way I would structure that if I were doing it, but just make sure that, I mean, if everyone's on this, if you want to work through it and just make sure you can get to the same point. If you have any problems getting this, we can, I can swing around and try and help work through it with you or something like that. But
I have a very stupid question.
what's up?
How do you get out of NPM start?
You got an NPM start because you're doing a create React app. Control C.
Yes, thank you.
It's not a stupid question. Not at all. I've got stuck in so many of those types of things. I usually just smash Control C and Control Z on anything that gets me stuck, and one of them is going to get me out at some point. That's my hope. And if not, I shut down my terminal window and start again. The whole window is dead. You're dead to me. I don't know what to do. And if that doesn't work, I restart my computer. So, and if that doesn't work, I'm in real trouble. So yeah, I mean, if people want to take a minute and work through this if you haven't already, and let me know if you're having any problems. We'll probably go to the next section in, I don't know, something, unless everyone says that they've already finished it by then. Just to give people a chance so they don't feel rushed right now. And yeah.
In the solution, when the React code's after the bar, it has React.render, and then in the tutorial it has React DOM.render.
Where did you see the React.render for this one?
When you click on solution.
Oh, on their solution? Let's see what they did. All right.
It just has React DOM. Not the DOM. I didn't know if it was necessary or
this is older code, I'm guessing. So React, yeah, a lot of this tutorial, and it's gonna have us do like create class too, which I'll teach you that, even though I need to look at the other tutorial and see what model they use. I'm guessing they use ES6 classes instead, which is the preferred one. So I don't know how to say this without being too confusing. There's not a difference, except I don't think this is supported on the newer React versions. So this is probably a pretty old version of React that they're using on this page. Let me look and see. Oh, did I scroll right by it? I saw it. I can't tell what they're using.
It's basically the same thing.
So yeah, the React.render is really, it's doing the exact same thing. The only difference is in newer versions of React, they moved that into a separate package, a separate library to handle DOM. manipulation because React is sometimes used in environments that aren't the browser. So you may, like, React is really, sort of flexible. And so React DOM is the way that you render something into a browser, but somebody else may have literally, I mean, no joke, like maybe an LED light, like one of those scrolling LED lights or something, and they want to render their content there. So if they have a different library to connect to that, it may be like React LED scrolling light dot render, and then it renders the content into that. And as long as that knows how to render, these React elements and stuff, then it'll render it onto that instead. So originally it was just DOM, and so they had that render attached right to React, but since then they've sort of moved into a separate library. It's a good question. If anybody's having any problems with this or any other questions, let me know. We'll move on probably about 7:25. And I recommend, while you guys are doing this stuff, play around as much as you can with different things. Like even go to the React site and read some of their stuff. Their tutorial, I feel like, is a lot harder in a sense, but maybe it's a good secondary path to try out. If you go through theirs, they're going to walk you through using their Create React app, Bootstrap, to build React apps. This is probably also, I haven't, again, this is just me being behind. I haven't sat down and gone through the Survive.js tutorial, but I'm probably going to try and suggest we use Create React app instead of the Webpack approach that they document, because it should just make it simpler. But yeah, when you're trying to learn this, there's a lot of different tools out there. The React documentation, and it all at first, you don't understand it. Hopefully you'll pick it up over time as you live in there and start working and come here and ask questions about stuff that you don't understand. Ask questions on Slack. If you guys are stuck on anything for homework or anything for what you're working on, ask on Slack, because there's a good chance other people are stuck on the same thing and might be able to help you work through it. That's not right. Maybe I didn't save this one. Does anybody want more time to work through this before we move on and talk about the idea of React components a little bit? No? All right, so who made it to the React components section of the tutorial? A few people? All right. Any questions or anything that came up from this one? This is where it starts to get much more complex, I feel like. Nothing.
Is there a list I know there is, of all the components, all of the different kinds that you can.
Of components? Not really, because React doesn't. At a high level, the way to describe React is there's two different types, if you will. There's two different types of elements or something like that in React. Like if we go back to this JSX, we look here, we've got these calls to react.create elements, right?
Mhm.
And these are creating, I guess it's really the same one for both. Let me double check this their documentation for a second, because I felt like there was a difference here, but I could be wrong. Okay, so I think it's just create element. So underneath, there's really only two different types or whatever in React. There's actually HTML elements and ones that are React components. So examples here in this original JSX page, right? A div is an HTML element. And then my counter is not something in HTML. And the way that a convention, you don't have to follow it, but a standard convention for React is that React components start with uppercase letters instead of lowercase. So you always start them with an uppercase just as a sort of a convention. So my counter is a custom one. Really, that's the only distinction that exists in React. And then when it comes to components, aka not the ones that are HTML elements, but React components that are something different, unless you pull in someone else's library of existing components that they have, you don't really start off with any components. You have to create all of them, the components that you want. So there's no pre-existing library of components. There's just a, here's how to create components, and now you can go create components as needed for what you want to do. Does that make sense? And so that's really, I guess, what this one is teaching you, is the process for creating a component. And you said, wait, why are you saying I'm creating a component? It literally says create class, not create component. That's dumb. I don't know why there's a difference in the terminology. So class is coming from the idea of JavaScript, any classical object handling, and so that's where terminology from. There, anything sort of built that way is referred to as a React component. So who made it through this one? Did anybody make it through? It was you, I know, but anybody else make it through this and get this one to succeed? Right?
I got kind of tripped up between the renders and the returns and like mix them up, so
right.
Look back and see.
This is where I do feel like the React community is doing disservice to people in a lot of ways because of their habit of inlining things. So it makes it, to me, harder to read the structure of it. So I'm going to sort of write it out with the inline style that's common in React, and then maybe I won't. Maybe I'll try and write it out this other way. We'll see if anything goes wrong by trying to write it out without that, right? So does anybody remember how we create an object literal in JavaScript? What's the easiest way to create an object?
An empty bracket.
In curly braces, right? And then how do we add properties to an object? You just give it a name and then a value, right? create a function. Anybody remember how to create a function? Or one of the ways? What? You could do it like this, right? I'm going to do it a little differently here with this other syntax. Say render, right? And this can be a function. And we don't know what's going in here yet, but we've got a function. We're going to call it render. So now on this vacancy sign lowercase v object literal that I'm creating, and I only put a lowercase v there so I can use the same, name. Let's add a render property to it. And that render property, all it is the render variable here. It's whatever this is, right? So this render property is just a reference to this function now. That generally makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? And so now we have an object literal, which has a render property, which is actually a function. So now let's go down here and let's use this React create class method or function. And what does create class take? It just takes an object, right? And we've already created an object, vacancy sign, that's, that's perfectly fine because that's an object that we created. So now we can even swap this out. Let's vacancy sign. I'm going to use another syntax. We can go over it in a little while or whatever. But so now instead of that, let me put it next to the other one just so we can see that they're both sort of there. And it's not happy with me for some reason. Right now. So, let's see. It should just be a function. We shouldn't care. Oh, it's probably just mad because my function doesn't return anything. So let's return something very simple. So there we go. Now I just have a render function, and all it's doing is returning this bit of JSX. And in this vacancy sign object, I'm setting my render property to be that function. And then I'm just passing that object in and saying this is the definition of my class for a vacancy sign. Does that make sense? Sort of all those pieces and building blocks. And then unfortunately, because this is the way a lot of this stuff ends up being written, if you take this and you start inlining it and saying, all right, what actually is vacancy sign? It's an object literal, right? So, oh, here's an object literal. Okay, now what does that have? Well, it has this render property. All right, what's the value of that render property? Well, it's whatever the value of this variable is, which is this function. So let's grab that function and set it here. And this tends to be more the syntax that you run into a lot in React, where there's sort of inline all of this stuff directly in there. But you can see you could define it out here all separately in a way where you can think about each piece by piece and sort of put it together. There's nothing preventing you from writing stuff out that way. And maybe it's easy for you to think about one way versus the other. The syntax you'll run into a lot is just that this syntax of inlining a lot of it. So you'll need to be comfortable at least reading that, but it doesn't mean you have to write your components that way. You can write them piece by piece. Yes?
Is either of the two considered like bad practice? Or are they both like still either one?
I wouldn't call either one of them bad practice. You may, there's certain situations where you could run into some issues having your stuff sort of declared out here in regards to your function being bound correctly, which we'll talk about later. You're probably not going to encounter immediately as a concern. It'll be a concern we'll have in a later class. The idea of how does it know the correct binding for this function. When you use create class to create your classes for React, it's usually not a problem. It does that magic for you for the most part, so it's not a concern. It's if we switch over to using a different syntax, which we probably will use a class syntax instead of create class, where we'll create them just in a little bit different way, then we'll have to keep track of that ourselves. Is that so far? Does that sort of make sense? I'm gonna go back. What? What was that? Yeah. I'm gonna go back to this syntax for the time being. And then if you want, I can rewrite all of what we're gonna go forward with in the other way of writing it. They're equivalent to each other. So I've got a vacancy sign, but what were we supposed to do with this vacancy sign? Well, first off, let's just get rid of our old content. Blah, blah. We don't want any of this around, right? We just want to render the vacancy sign. And I did something here. I could write this way. Vacancy sign. To say, here's my element, and here's the end of it, and there's no content. But there's this shorthand you can use, and it comes from the idea of self-closing elements in HTML, which is just put the sort of that slash at the end of the first tag, and you don't have to write it out again. So if there's no content, if you don't have anything to put inside of this element, you can write it using this sort of shorthand notation to save you some typing. That's really all that's doing. Does anybody remember what we were supposed to do with the vacancy sign?
You have to pass it a variable, true or false.
Right. We're supposed to pass it a true or false, right? And then change what we render based off of that. Okay. So what was our property name?
Has vacancy.
Has, okay. They did it weird. They did it like all lowercase too, which is not how I would do it, but whatever. So let's just
do like camel case.
Yeah, I would do camel case. Let's just do it the same way. Camel case in case you're not comfortable with it. The idea is it's like a camel. It starts low and it bumps up for each word. It has a little camel bump. Hence camel case. So let's give it a has vacancy property. And you notice what I did here was I used the curly braces. So what I'm telling it there is this next part's going to be a JavaScript expression. This isn't just straight JSX, right? So let's set it to true. And then we're going to figure out what to do with this. And this is probably one of the reasons why people don't write stuff out this way, because it's going to be a little weird that this function is going to assume the context that it runs in. But all right, we've got our render function here. And whenever you have a Java or a React component, do people remember how to access the properties on it from this tutorial so far? Any properties, anything that property that we set on this React component? This dot props. All right, so let's try something here. Let's just see if that works in some respect, right? This dot props dot as vacancy. Oops, I better make that, escape that this way. Oh, it's gonna yell at me, are you? Maybe it doesn't know how to render that.
If you pass in a string instead of a boolean.
I'm gonna try that. Oh, that'll be a boolean. Can I do toString? I don't know if it's gonna work. Oh, I did. Okay. So, all right, I'm just rendering the result of, or rendering my property. So let's see what happens if I change it. False. So I can access it for sure. But now what I want to do instead is I want to change a message off of it. This should be a familiar pattern. It shouldn't feel too awkward. How can we do something like that?
If else.
Simple if else, right? You can do if this dot props dot has vacancy. We want to do something. Else. All right. I'm going to get rid of this to not lead you, and we'll just do this together. We'll build this out. So what do we want to do if there is a vacancy? Do we want to say there's a vacancy? Any idea for how we can do that?
If the person enters in true or yes or no.
Right. Yeah, we have that bit. So what about, how are we going to, what are we going to do different
Put it in a variable.
here instead of render? Okay, let's use a variable of some kind. So let's have var message equals, and let's start it with nothing. So what's our message if there's a vacancy? Message equals vacancy. That's such a weird word. I don't know if other people find it a weird word. I do. Yeah. And what's our message if there's no vacancy? Yeah. Right? So simple message is. What are we missing from this render now?
Return.
Yeah, it's going to render whatever we return, right? So what did we have before? We had some sort of like div, replace me div. So what can we maybe return from this? Return message?
Div with message inside of it.
All right, let's try message directly. So message isn't going to work, and that's honestly the first thing I would have tried too. And it's not going to work on its own because, well, even if, here, let me fix it and make it so we actually return. Oh, we did the message. It would have been correct here, but it still didn't render. And the reason is because this is the one thing that React does expect. It expects a certain type of thing from the render, the return from the render, right? In this case, it expects something that it knows how to actually render. And a string needs an element of some kind. So if we give it a div, it knows how to render that. And we can put something in here, like we did message. Okay. That's not what we're trying to get. You remember how to curly braces. So we have no vacancy, and then we can test it. True vacancy. does the idea generally make sense about what's going on with that? A little better?
I think it's kind of weird how you use like HTML syntax to write the vacancy sign function out.
Yeah, the inline JSX.
Yeah.
It is weird, and that's why I said some people really don't like it. They hate the idea of this. You got your HTML in my JavaScript, and so instead, I mean, we could swap this out, right? But it gets more complex because if I didn't want to use this. Let me see if I can do it. I'll see if I can get this syntax right. Return React dot create element, and then I'm creating a div, and it doesn't have any special properties, and the body of it is message. So that would be that's valid. That's the equivalent of what we did here. But it's valid JavaScript. So like this wouldn't have to run through a JSX to JavaScript interpreter to become valid JavaScript. This is valid JavaScript. And that works really nicely when you have like one line, something like this. It's not very hard. But if instead, for example, we had a more complex thing like var var like let's make what am I table of contents, and let's make that just sort of like a JSX. So we wrote something. This is going to be more complex. We've got some sort of to start with, and then inside of there we're going to have you know, a paragraph for chapter 1 or something. So yeah. And, you know, another paragraph for you know, some more details, right? Chapter 2 even. It doesn't even have to be that complex. Let's say that's all we have. This is still a simple book, right? And this was really easy to write out. We're to convert this into valid JavaScript directly. It would look like this. Let me try and get this. What?
It's gonna look bad.
I'm gonna call it TSC, and I'm gonna do a React.create element. We have a div, and then it doesn't have any special properties, and then its body is this is going to have to be an array of React.create element, and this one is a paragraph, and it also doesn't have anything there, and then it has chapter 1 here, and then React.create element and a paragraph, and it's null, and this is chapter 2, and then I think that's equivalent. I could be wrong. I'm gonna test this. I don't know if this is going to even work because we may have to. I may not be able to write multiple items. Hold on. I'm going to put all this inside of a div. I'm going to do some JSX here to make my life easy as I write this out. All right, we'll put this in, and we'll put TOC in, and then we'll leave our vacancy sign in. This is just me. You guys don't need to copy this. I'm just showing you some stuff here, just mucking around. probably did something wrong here. Oh, I did do something wrong. I'm gonna need some curly braces around this stuff. Pretty sure. And then maybe you'll run. I'm sure I've got stuff all over the place. It's wrong in this. This whole thing is like, what are you doing? You're trying to ruin me. But hey, the vacancy, no vacancy thing still seems to be, oh no, it's not rendering right anymore either. I broke it all.
Wouldn't you need like a render
There, that's
inside
right.
of the table of contents?
Yeah.
Because right now it's just around like parentheses.
Oh, thank you. No, I don't. I'm gonna do something bad here. Don't pay attention to what I'm doing. I'm doing something magical. Don't watch.
I know it's good.
Don't watch the magic. I think that'll work. Maybe not. Still not right. Shouldn't need to return here. That should work. That should work. Why aren't you happy? That didn't change. This didn't run. This didn't work.
What if you comment out TOC for a minute?
This is not. Let me do this, and then maybe he'll be a little happier. Are you happy now? Are you still not happy? Table of contents. Table of contents. The version of React running on here may not support me doing this. I might be doing something that it doesn't support. I'm creating a specific type of React component, which is known as a functional component, which is really nice and easy. Maybe I should be teaching them because it's probably easier to learn them at first, but it's magic. Oh, okay. Just wasn't happy. Maybe does TOC work? Will that work? No. Neither one of those are happy. I can render a vacancy sign a second time, I'm sure. That's another great thing about this. See, like we created this component, so we're not limited to one rendering of it. We can have it as many times as we want, and each one of those is a separate instance with its own variable. So this is more like we're creating a little strip of hotels, right? We can play around a little bit if we want to now, and we could compose something a little more complex than what we already have. So maybe instead of vacancy signs just directly, we want to create. Let me put it down here after this. We want to create a hotel component. I'm going to use the inline syntax, create class. My object is just inlined right here. And our hotel will render what are some properties that you would expect on a hotel? It should have a name, right? Or something. So let's expect that we passed in a name property to a hotel. Is there anything else you're thinking like a hotel should have that? We'll just give it a name. This dot props name. And then we'll put a colon. And then this is going to be interesting. I'm not going to explain exactly how to do this right at first, but let's see what happens. So instead of directly rendering some vacancy signs, let's create some hotels. A hotel, which has a name of, I don't know, Best Western. And then let's create another one. What's another hotel name?
Holiday Inn.
Holiday Inn. Right?
Hilton.
You can create a Hilton, right? So now we've got a, this is more like a, you know, off-ramp. That's the, you're driving, you've had a long day, you have to stop somewhere, you pull in, you're trying to find out which hotel has some room. But we have a problem right now. All of our hotels say they don't have vacancy.
And how are we going to find the hotel if we don't have location for them?
You just pulled off the off-ramp. They're just right there. You're desperate. You don't have a phone or anything on you. You're all you can do is pull off the off-ramp and go, I'm going to stay at one of these hotels here. Great. This is old school. This is pre-cell phone era, right? You're like, I hope somewhere. So the problem is they all have a vacancy sign, right? But the vacancy sign isn't getting a property for each one of them for has vacancy. So if we were to look at this code, what happens? This dot props dot has vacancy. Well, that's not true. It's going to be, yeah, it's going to be undefined. So this if isn't true, which means it runs the else, right? Oh, okay. Well, maybe we can solve that. Has vacancy equals true. That's awesome, except I'm going to change this. There we go. The vacancy shows up right after each one. Yeah, people a little distracted by that. Just a little bit. I don't even know what's going on over there,
Sounds
but
like wrestling.
sounds pretty epic. Yeah. So does anyone have any idea? And this is going to get into how some of React stuff works and how you can pass things down. And actually is a good lead in, although I don't think we're really going to get all the way through this events section, the next section. This is a good lead into that section because it sort of helps start connecting some of that in some way. How could we give each hotel that we've created a different value for vacancy instead of all giving them one value?
Can you pass them in at the bottom of the hotel tag?
I'm starting to see some idea come here. So what if we have a has vacancy for each hotel here, right? Has vacancy equals, and the Best Western is false. And what about the Holiday Inn? Has vacancy. How about our Hilton? What? False. It's booked too. Okay. That's cool. And this stuff didn't change. Can anyone explain to me why that didn't change?
In the hotel definition, it's just
true, right?
It's always
you have to
It's
change
always
it.
true.
You have to check the property.
So
has render.
what's that? So if we passed a property into our hotel for has vacancy, right? So if we want to read that property inside of our render for our hotel, how can we read a property?
This props.
This dot props dot has vacancy. So you can see all we're doing there is just passing that value down again and again and setting it as a property on each component in the chain, right? So our hotel has a has vacancy property, and then we just pass it into our vacancy sign object, and so it can just get that value straight off of it. And now, you know, if we change it for any of them, it changes and passes that new value right down through the component chain.
sense.
Does that make sense to people? Yeah? So this is a pretty complex little bit of logic that we wrote here. But I hope you can start to see some of the value for React's composition with these properties, because you can pass things down through and do a lot of really powerful composing to create stuff this way, right? Sort of been all over the place on that. Any other questions at this components level right now? No? Is this professional wrestling or basketball? LeBron James is a wrestler now? Oh my gosh, I'm so confused. This is all being recorded. Everyone's going to hear my crazy confusion and this weird background noise going on. It's still showing my screen. Good, it is. All right, so events. I don't think anyone made it through the events section, right? But did some people at least take a glance at it, look at it? All right. Did you make it through? You just look at it. Awesome. This one I expected, if anyone got to it, to get tripped up on, because there was something that the tutorial really didn't explain how to do in it. And so you would have had to go somewhere else to get the answer for it. So before we dive into events for React and how React does events, because a lot of people here haven't really worked with events in the DOM. We'll dig into this and more. Probably now there's professional wrestling down here. This is not the worst I've ever had. The worst I've ever had for a class was literally a parade going by during class. A literal parade.
Inside.
What?
Inside.
We were in downtown Raleigh, and we were upstairs. They put us in the back classroom in the the building or whatever for the Iron Yard there, and I guess the front one. And there was literally a St. Patrick's Day parade going past. And I was like, all right, we're just not having class until the parade's done. Because nobody can hear anything. So before we get into this for React and how it's hooking stuff up, let's talk a little bit about just event handlers in HTML in general and how you can hook things up. So HTML, there's all sorts of different events that happen in your browser, right? We've clicked on buttons in our browser and had it do something before. So it's something we're familiar with. So let's add a button here. What?
The output.
It may not be happy. Click me, right? So we've added a button, all right. And just for the sake of me getting rid of this right now, I'm going to get rid of that container reference on that, so React doesn't know where to hook up to. React's trying to inject itself, and it's like, I can't find it. So we're clean, right? We've got a button that says click me, but it's not doing anything when you click it right now. So there's a whole bunch of event handlers that exist on browser elements, and you can look up references for all of this stuff. DOM events. This is my preferred documentation reference, by the way, devdocs.io. I just find it useful because it puts a lot of, you can choose which pieces of documentation you want there, but it pulls it from a whole bunch of other sites and collects them all in one location. So I don't have to bounce around to different sites to get documentation. So you can look here, like, what are the different types of events that can happen? Like, what are some of the mouse events that happen? You can have click, or double click, or mouse down, or mouse enter, or mouse leave. And so what is a, like, you can this is gonna be, this isn't fun to look at. But there's all these different types of events. So how can we attach them? What could we do to have this event do something? Well, there's several different ways, but we can look right here and begin to see, oh, here's one way to attach an event of some kind. This document.getElementById. All right, that looks similar to what we were putting in our React code, right? So let's step over here. Let's give this button an ID. ID equals button. And then I'm just going to act like none of this stuff exists. Go away. All right. So let's get a reference to that button. Button equals document.getElementById. And this document object that this getElementById method is on, by the way, that's just saying the HTML document. That's all that means. And our ID is button. So now we should have a reference to our button. So now we can add a click event to our button and say when click happens, oh, I wrote this wrong. Hold on. I want to use the same syntax that they were using. Add event listener. So we're adding an event listener for a specific type of event. So I'm going to copy it up through here just to be lazy. So we're going to add an event listener. An add event listener takes two arguments. Normally it takes the event that you want to listen to, and then it takes the action you want to take when that event happens. So let's have an action. Let's call it the click event. And we're going to call a function of some kind. And what this is going to do is just alert. You clicked me. Right? So we're just going to give an alert. So now we can hear for our action we want to take when this click event happens is we can say click event. All right? So we've attached something to a portion of our document to take an action. Now you guys can go have mad fun adding events to HTML pages that you create all over the place. You can have all sorts of different events. This doesn't have to be a click. It could have been on or mouse over, I think. I don't know if this is going to work. We'll see. Time I just went over the top of it. And it fired. Because that's a different event that the browser knows about and will fire for you. And you can go up. Now it's all, you can see there are just tons and tons of different events. And some of them are valid on different elements, you know, different locations. And when you fire one of these events, there's also information attached to it. Now, we're not doing anything with that right now. I think in that click event, you can see that the function that it calls, it passes this event object to it with information about what that event was. We'll talk about that more later. Not too important immediately. So there's another way also to add an event handler to something inside of your DOM, and it's an older way to do it, and a lot of times it was discouraged, and that was this, you can write something, you can write it right here on your object. So here we can just write some JavaScript. I think this is going to work, it may not, so we'll see if something goes wrong here. What? You clicked me. Let's see if this works. So this is another way to hook up an event handler. You can see we have some JavaScript here just in quotes. This is one of the reasons this is a nightmare to work with, because you don't get any nice syntax highlighting and stuff. None of your nice, friendly, useful things. But it did allow us to quickly hook up an event to it, right? Another problem with this approach is if somebody else like programmatically connected an event handler in JavaScript, it could override this and your event wouldn't fire, and you can have all sorts of weird side effects through some of that. So in traditional HTML, it's discouraged to hook up your event handlers using this syntax. But that's sort of two different ways to add something to fire on an event. So we could also change this, right? Because we did on click. What about on mouse over? Just as valid. I didn't actually have to click on it. I can just go over the top of it. Or any of the other events that we wanted to hook up to. And we can take sort of whatever action we want to take off of those events on different elements inside of our HTML. Does that generally make sense, that concept, being able to connect events, fire events? Awesome. So we're not gonna, I don't think we're actually gonna go through this next step of the React tutorial. We'll follow up with this in the next class because we're starting to get into some of the more complex React bits. What I will say is one thing that I feel like it glossed over or missed that you're really going to need to finish this tutorial successfully, or this step of it, is, let me bring the code back so that you can see it. All right, we have our container. Let me get rid of all of my blank lines here. So one thing that it didn't talk about is how, all right, we have a perform magic method that's sort of on this parent component, right? But how do we access this? How can we refer to that at all? And I feel like the tutorial, let me double check. I don't think it ever actually dealt with how you would, a little bit, but I feel like it sort of glossed over it too. If you have something declared directly on your object, like in this case, this parent component, perform magic, the way you get a reference to that, it's not a property that was passed in. It's just part of your object already. So you can get a reference to it somewhere by doing, like if inside of this, we could say variable perform magic equals this dot perform magic. So that's how you refer to things that are directly declared on your components, like this is a property directly of the component. And you can test that that's true. You should never, ever do something like this in a render function. But we could call like perform magic. Now, you can see it's already like, the minute I finished writing it, it was like, ah. So this is a reference to this function, and then it calls it. But that's, I think that was one of the things that it didn't really give a good answer to, is if you need a reference to something that's on your, on this object literal, you just use this dot to get a reference to anything that's directly on that object literal. So in this case, like, you would end up passing that down to your child component somehow so that it knows to call that. And we just went over how you can pass anything down in, right? Using the, we passed a prop down a couple layers on our little hotel example. So, and this will still probably be challenging, but I would encourage you to try and go through, anyone who didn't make it this far, make sure you work through the rest of the sort of React tutorial, and then try and work through this. And the next one is, I believe, state. Try and work through these next two. Even if you don't fully understand them, give it some time. If you have questions while you're trying to work through them, ask those questions on Slack, because other people or me will probably try and help you out as you're working through them. And then if you want to continue, you can go into this under the hood, but this is getting pretty deep to me about what's going on behind the scenes with React. So this is probably this flies over my head most of the time. What?
And that's it. That's the last page.
That's the last page of this set of tutorials. Everything else after that are other articles on this site, but you don't need to read. You know, you can if you want, but you don't need to. And then if anybody makes it through that and they feel like they really wanted to challenge themselves before we dive into our Survive.js tutorial, you can always try and go through the official tutorial on the React documentation. This one is much more complicated. This one has a lot going on. So it'll be a lot more difficult. And my plan is not to go through it as a class. So that's something that you could try yourself. And if you have questions, I'll try and address them, but we're not going to walk through all of this. We're going to, after we finish our React tutorial, the other one we're doing, we're going to switch over to try and go through that Survive.js on a more complex app. Any other questions? So people don't feel singled out. Anyone feeling overwhelmed? Like this is a lot? There we go. Yeah. All right.
We got like free cooking.
Yeah. you can keep working through their stuff. I mean,
Do they have a React?
their content is. I don't think they do. Their content is really good, especially, you know, for people who didn't work all the way through the HTML5 and CSS. I think that's great.
So I'm in the jQuery one, and that one's actually pretty fun to see how you can do multiple things to big parts at the same time. But I had taken from one of those links on the React tutorial where it gives you examples. Like I pulled up the calculator one that Facebook put out. That's the reason why I got stuck in PM Start, is because I wanted to see one how you can actually use it and how they wrote it. And yeah,
It gets much more complex.
that was.
They have a React.
I literally got to the middle of the page
Did you-
and saw the buttons, and that started to make sense because we had done that in this tutorial. But there was a lot of other language in there.
They've thrown together. Oh, they don't have anything in it yet, though. They've got Learn React challenges coming soon,
It says 5 hours.
and then they have React projects, 200 hours.
Oh no.
But these are big projects. Come on. Has anyone ever seen The Game of Life? It's a classic programmer geeky thing.
What about tic-tac-toe?
Tic-tac-toe is that's what the React tutorial has you build, I believe. The official one from React. Is that what it does? Do they?
Have you built tic-tac-toe?
Is that what they have you build?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, it has you build tic-tac-toe.
See, that's what the calculator looks like, but it doesn't have even stuff that makes sense with that. It literally had, I closed it, but it had dot on build and then all this other mess, and then somewhere right in the middle of it, it had the squares and
When I
the
was here
colors,
to
and
put the image, I was stuck.
it's supposed to be a basic React example.
So we just showing basic.
Yeah, you guys are starting to step up. You guys are starting to step up to the next level of software development. So we're going to build a lot of small little React components. I wouldn't worry too much. We're going to build a lot of small ones and build a lot of small reference things that help build up, right? But this is the next level of software development. You start working with stuff where you can't. I would say the next step up is where you can't think about your program all at once.
Okay.
There's too much for you to think about, and so you have to instead think about pieces at a time.
Have you done the basic JavaScript on the free code camp? Is it pretty?
I haven't gone through it.
It's supposedly 10 hours. Is that
If-
the HTML5 and the CSS?
If
with
people
music?
don't feel comfortable so far with,
pretty easy still. It's kind of pretty much what you went through with this class.
yeah, if you want more hands-on, with JavaScript, just in general, I think that's fine to go through.
Basic algorithm.
Yeah, not deal. Yeah. Yeah.
This is gonna sound really funny, but if I start with the hard and then go to the simple, it makes more sense to me. I don't know why.
Yeah, this basic algorithm scripting, that's the type of thing that would be a lot of more complex programming examples. Reversing a string, you know, checking for palindromes. Those are all challenging problem. This Saturday or the one after?
And
Yeah.
No.
I'm gonna check with Harris to make sure that he feels comfortable leading because I'm not gonna be here this Saturday. I've got to go act like I can run, even though I can't. Oh, I need to stop my recording. See, I'm about to say embarrassing stuff, and that's when I realized I need to stop my recording.